Evening, guys. Hopefully your night is going well. Let me turn down my volume here to make sure that I don't blow up my computer over here. Good. So what will be happening is we'll get started in just about a minute or two. Tomorrow's test, chapters 33 to 34. We will be taking that test during the first half of the class period. Second half, we'll be taking a look at the remainder of the course. We're moving to periods 8 and 9, and we'll be taking a look at how World War II, Franklin Roosevelt, New Deal are going to have a transformative effect on the United States from this point forward. We've become more comfortable with a more liberal viewpoint on how the government should work, but we're going to find that not everybody is thrilled about that. And so the current battles that you have between conservatives and liberals that we have in our politics, a lot of that goes back to the 1930s and 40s, especially with the reforms that Franklin Roosevelt's going to put in place. My hope is that the World War II work for you this past weekend has not been too difficult. We do have a number of questions that we'll be getting to, and so we'll be getting started with those. And as you can see over on the side, Sophia's already started the ball rolling with posting questions over on the side, so we'll make sure that we get to those questions too. So I'm going to be starting in period 1, and period 1 and period 4 have a question that's identical, and they both have to do with the good neighbor policy. And so when we take a look at Franklin Roosevelt, he is involved in changing our foreign policy. Our foreign policy went through a change in the 1920s and 30s already, where we became isolationist. After previously we had been imperialistic, and we were imperialistic with Roosevelt, Taft, Wilson, Big Stick, dollar, moral diplomacy. And then for Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover, there's a feeling that we should dial back the Washington Naval Conference, the Kellogg-Briand Pact, and those sorts of things are convincing Americans to stay out of war. What Franklin Roosevelt is struggling with, though, is he's struggling with what got us into World War I. And in particular, it was partially that feeling of anger and hostility that Mexico had towards the United States, where they were willing to accept arms shipments and aid from Germany that led to a Zimmerman note that could have dragged Mexico into World War I against the United States. There was also a problem with trade, where our gigantic trade tariffs with the Smoot-Hawley tariff was making it really hard to trade with other countries. And the more economically unstable Latin American countries were, the more likely they would be to go to an alliance with some sort of dictatorship like Adolf Hitler or Benito Mussolini. So what the good neighbor policy is it's trying to create an agreement with Latin American countries that's essentially saying to them that we want to establish trade with them to try to improve their situation. And instead of like the big stick policy or the big sister policy where America is dominant, we're trying to establish an opportunity for free trade. And that's where they start talking about like reciprocal agreements where we might keep our tariffs high, but we might work out a special deal with a country like Brazil that says, if you're willing to lower your tariffs on our stuff, we'll lower ours on your stuff, or maybe just on specific products that they're really good at making. But for Franklin Roosevelt, he really builds up his reputation and America's reputation with Latin American countries, because it really feels like for the first time in a while, there's a leader who's willing to work with them on not like a dominant power, weaker power sort of way, but instead as trying to be more trade equals, with the eye towards the idea that we're trying to build an alliance against fascism as it starts rising, and having those countries be friendly with us seems like a really good idea. So hopefully that helps out. I'll do a refresh on period 1, but period 1 is normally my more quiet group, and so I don't have a lot of questions there. I'll double back and take a look and see if any more pop up. But I'm moving to period 2 right now, and in period 2, the first question is, how did the Neutrality Acts of 1939 hurt China? And in particular, what we want to think about is America was supposed to be protecting China with the open door policy. Japan became imperialistic, and when they saw America doing things like agreeing in the Washington Naval Conference to reduce our Navy size and to not build up our fortifications in the Pacific, Japan got the idea that America was no longer defending their imperial possessions. So multiple times in the 1930s, Japan invaded Manchuria, and FDR wanted to send supplies to China to try to help aid them in protecting against the Japanese assaults. And that's when isolationists came in and accused Franklin Roosevelt of breaking the Neutrality Acts, trying to drag us into war. And so, even though he wanted to try to aid China to resist Japan's expansion, he wasn't allowed to do so. And that's going to eventually send even more of a message to Japan that all of our possessions, Guam, the Philippines, even Hawaii, might be vulnerable because of the fact that America is not ready to defend their interests at that time. The next question I see, how did the tactic unconditional surrender work? When you're reading about unconditional surrender in chapter 34, that's referring to Japan, and the conditions that were made with Japan is a lot of times countries will say, hey, we'll surrender on these conditions. We want to keep our leaders. We don't want to invade our territory. We want to have these certain considerations. And part of what drags the war in the Pacific on longer is the condition of unconditional surrender. The idea that Japan is going to surrender with no conditions to be dominated by the United States after the war is done is pretty non-negotiable when it comes to the United States because of Pearl Harbor and the horrible fighting that's taking place in the Pacific. The fear of an emperor who is seen as like a godlike figure by the people who, to the point where he's been convincing people to engage in the Bushido Code and kamikaze attacks. There's a feeling that we need to remove the leadership of Japan, but it's also very punitive in nature. And what we'll find is that in Germany, that sort of stipulation isn't quite as needed because you've got other countries racing in, like Russia. And so there's a lot of animosity that's going on. There's a racial component that's going on with it too, where we've got a hatred for Japan because of all the things that's happened in the Pacific, and there's horrible atrocities there are absolutely well known. But that's what unconditional surrender is about: is the idea that Japan needs to surrender without any conditions before the war is over. And that leads to then the discussion of invading the Japanese mainland and the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which does eventually end the war. I see a question for another one for the good neighbor policy. So hopefully my first response was able to help out with that. The second question I see, though, is can I explain the ABC-1 agreement between the British? So ABC stands for America, Britain, and Canada. And it's the agreement that formally determines what the strategy of the war is going to be when the war gets started for the United States. And this is where the Germany first policy is going to come in. The focus on taking out Germany first and then focusing on the Pacific. So in the Pacific, what you should have seen is the idea of island hopping. So during the World War II, America will be working their way across the Pacific Ocean. The problem, though, is all of the war supplies are going to be prioritized for Europe first, with the idea that if we can save England, if we can help recover France, if we can protect Russia, all of those countries, once Germany stops being a threat, can throw all of their resources towards the Pacific Ocean and help in a united effort to attack the Japanese. Where on the other hand, if Germany wins and they knock England out of the war or France out of the war, then their colonial possessions are going to be lost. But then also, if England gets conquered, it's really hard to figure out staging areas where you'll be able to start up an assault to try to wipe the Nazis off of the European continent. So that's what the ABC First Plan is going about. I see another question. Can I explain the relationship between Mussolini, Hitler, Franco, and Stalin? So these are all dictators. Mussolini and Hitler are united with the idea that each of them has a grievance from World War I, where Italy flip-flopped midway through World War I, went from being united with the Germans to being united with the British and the French. And then at the Treaty of Versailles, they were told to get lost by the British and the French. And so they became angry that they weren't involved in the negotiations. They were left out. They weren't really seen as a significant power like the other countries. Adolf Hitler obviously is bitter about the Treaty of Versailles, has grievances about it. And so that's what's going to unite Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini together into this Axis alliance. With Francisco Franco, that is the fascist leader that is put in place in Spain to replace the the democracy that had existed previously. And he's going to get aid from Adolf Hitler's weaponry to help him to win the war. During the war, though, Spain is going to be neutral, but they're going to be very tight with the Germans. And so even though they're not officially fighting, they're funneling resources and information from Spain to Germany to help them out in the war effort, but they're not interested in being part of the war itself. And then when it comes to Stalin, he's the communist leader of the Soviet Union, and he is the opponent of all fascists, where he is not a big fan of fascism or capitalism like we have it. And so the only reason why he's going to join with the United States is because when Hitler double crosses Russia, we have a shared enemy, and that's going to be the reason why we joined together at that time. That's all the questions I see for period 2. Let me hit refresh and see if I've got anything else that pops up. I see nothing, so I'm going to move to period 4. Period 4 has the preponderance of the questions, and so I'm excited to get working with you guys. But again, if you have any other questions that pop up, please feel free to put them onto the right-hand side where Sophia has her question. So we'll start off with the first question I see here. It says in the textbook that FDR wasn't interested in the London Economic Conference and instead wanted to focus on gold juggling and inflationary prices back at home. Could you explain what the textbook meant? And so what is happening in the conference that's happening over in London is they're trying to figure out ways not to allow currency manipulation to take place. And if you paid attention in the last election, President Trump was very worried about the fact that he labeled China as being a currency manipulator nowadays. And so what China is notorious for doing is at times they can make their currency, their money, stronger or weaker. And what that means is they can kind of mess around with the rates of exchange for how much like American dollars it will take to be able to match up to the exchange value for the Chinese currency. And you can mess with this by either adding to or taking away money in your money supply. And what you'll learn in your economics classes in 12th grade then is if you make your dollar stronger or weaker, it then increases or decreases its buying power. And if you do that, you can then rig foreign trade because your dollar, if it's stronger or weaker, will then have better or worse buying power in certain situations. And so it's complicated. What the Europeans want to do is they want to peg it, though. They want to say this amount of dollars is going to be equal to this number of British pounds. And that way, that America would lose their ability to then tweak their currency because if we're stuck on the gold standard, you can't really tweak it. But FDR wants to have the freedom to then like add money into the supply or take it away, play around with interest rates with the idea of trying to save our own economy. The problem, though, is that all of these countries around the world are in worse shape than the United States. And they're looking for just some sort of currency stability, and America tells them to get lost. And so because of that, we maintain the flexibility to do things with our currency that we would like to, but it means the other countries are kind of left on their own. And we've already seen before this time that they were having trouble even before then. The next question I see is asking the question, what is appeasement? And appeasement is essentially just giving in to a dictator, giving them some of what they want in the hope that they will be appeased or they will be satisfied that they've gotten enough and they will stop being aggressive with their neighbors. What we've typically found with appeasement, though, is when you try to appease dictators, dictators will oftentimes take that as a signal of weakness, and they will then start taking more and more, which is what we saw Hitler, Mussolini, Hirohito, and others doing when they saw that the League of Nations was weak and the United States wasn't interested in stepping into foreign policy. The next question, can I break down the countries involved with the Allies and the countries supporting the Axis? Axis powers are easy. So imagine an axis running through Europe that the entire continent is spinning on, and that's going to be Germany and Italy, and then they've got Japan as their ally. Many times kids will wonder, especially with the history of racial prejudice that you have in Nazi Germany, they'll ask the question, how is it Japan and Germany are on the same team, or what would have happened if they would have met? And they were planning on dealing with that later on. There's no doubt that for each of them, they looked at the other one as not being equal to them nationalistically, but they both shared the same enemies. And so that's the reason why they allied is they all hate the British, they all hate the French, they all hate the United States, they don't like the League of Nations. And so that's what's bringing them together. The main allies for the Allied powers, England, the United States, France, Russia, and then they've got dozens of other countries. Most notably to us, Canada is going to be our closest here in the United States, who are all joined together against the rising totalitarian threat. But that's kind of tricky because Russia is totalitarian, but their enemy is our enemy, and so that's the reason why we unite. Let me see here. What happened with Japanese concentration camps in America after the war is over? So your internment camps that they had in the desert were closed up after World War II was done. The Japanese citizens who found themselves there, though, found themselves in a desperate economic situation because of the fact that they were forced to sell rapidly to buyers who knew that they had to evacuate quickly. So most of their wealth that they had built up over decades of living here in the country evaporated quite quickly. So much so that when we got to the 1980s, Ronald Reagan put forward a bill that was passed and approved that paid reparations to Japanese internees to pay them for the time and the losses that they had. So even though it's not a lot, and even though it happened decades later, some attempt was made to square up with them. The anger that was created was for Americans who are either Native American or African American. They noticed the odd situation where the Japanese internees, for losing a few years, got paid, but for people who had been either enslaved or lost their territory through broken treaties, they got nothing, which is kind of one of the legacies that we have of that time. Let me see here. The next question: what countries did the United States send Lend-Lease to, and how did that affect the war? America is most notably going to be sending Lend-Lease supplies to England, Russia, and China. But they're going to be sending it to dozens of other countries around the world, Australia, all throughout North Africa. And in fact, what we're going to find is with Lend-Lease supplies, this is where America's really large superpower status takes off. Because of the fact that they're able to use this program to build like docks and shipyards and military bases and all these things during the war. And then after the war, many of those countries will work out deals with the United States to still maintain those. And so just knowing that when you see that question, that you should be thinking about the term arsenal of democracy, and then you'll be good. Let me see here. Did the American post that stayed in the Philippines after the Tydings-McDuffie Act affect the outcome of the Japanese invasion of the war? Good question. That act was created with the idea that we would hand over the Philippines in 1946. The problem is World War II for the Philippines started in 1941, and so those military bases got overrun quickly. And what was determined in the Nine Powers Conference was the agreement that America wouldn't fortify their military bases. And so when Japan attacked at Pearl Harbor, they attacked at Pearl Harbor and at Guam and at the Philippines and at all these British and French possessions. And a lot of this stuff gets lost because for Franklin Roosevelt, he's trying to figure out how to rally people to the war. And one of the most striking things that's important about World War II is he talks eloquently about how Pearl Harbor was a day that will live in infamy. But in the Philippines, Manila was, I believe, our fifth or sixth largest city at the time in United States control. But for most Americans, they wouldn't admit to that because the Philippines were something uniquely different because of the insular cases. But the Philippines get overrun, and MacArthur, who is stationed there, is forced to flee. People who are defending that area are subjected to the Bataan Death March. So the island falls really quickly. Japan is going to grant the Philippines a version of independence, but essentially the Japanese military is going to be using that kind of island for military bases and for resources. And it becomes pretty desperate in the Philippines until they get retaken at the end of the war. Let me see here. Are there major turning points for America joining the war between the fall of France and the bombing of Pearl Harbor? What we really want you to notice from chapter 34, and this is what I'll be highlighting for you when you come to class to kind of highlight where we're going afterwards. But you should notice that when it comes to World War II, America is going to choose to take a wide-ranging path rather than the straight-on approach. And so the battle that is most important when it comes to World War II is going to be the Battle of D-Day in 1944. But this map is going to be key to understanding what the United States is up to When the United States entered the war in 1941, we're going to find that the French have already surrendered. Spain has already gone in a fascist direction. And in particular, I want you to notice in your textbook what the Germans are doing. The Germans are trying to move west, either into Russia, or else they're trying to get across here into the Middle East through Egypt. And the reason why they're doing that is the Germans are really good at building incredibly strong tanks that have huge amounts of armor. They also gobble a ton of gas, and they don't have oil inside their country in significant numbers. They're trying to create like artificial fuels, and their scientific team is on the ball. Same thing with the United States. So if you notice the Office of Scientific Research and Development in your documentary, the OSRD for the United States, like one of the problems they have is in the Pacific, we lose access to all of the rubber trees that are used to create rubber. And so we just invent an artificial rubber during World War II with a government business partnership that's taking place that's pumping millions of dollars into this to try to get this technology invented. The Germans are trying to invent synthetic fuels, but they really want to invade Russia to get to the oil fields or get through North Africa to get to the oil fields. So here are your stages in the war. At the beginning of the war, you've got Britain fighting here in North Africa. America's going to join them after clearing out the U-boats in the Atlantic Ocean up here. When they go into North Africa, they're going to use Lend-Lease supplies to build military bases and supply depots all the way here. And the goal is to stop the Germans from getting the oil fields here in the Middle East. When in North Africa, America and Britain are able to stop Erwin Rommel, who is leading his tank corps against the British and the Americans, the Russians are going to be really asking a ton for the United States to jump into the war in a D-Day style invasion over here in Western Europe, with the idea that that would then distract the Germans from the Russians. You should notice that for the Americans, we lose thousands of people in the war. We're pretty certain Russia lost between 16 and 20 million people in the war, and that's men, women, and children. And they're cognizant of the fact that we allow them to absorb the punishment from Germany. So after World War II is done, we're together because the enemy of my enemy is my friend. For the Russians, though, they're going to be intensely mad about the fact that we allowed them to absorb punishment while we're in North Africa first. And then when they ask us for help, we move into Italy and we move up into Italy to take out Benito Mussolini. And then we go into D-Day, and D-Day is right up here in North France. Now, the problem with D-Day is it's a great heroic moment. It's an amazing invasion by the United States. It really deserves to be noticed and understood. The dilemma, though, for the United States, and this is something the Russians are perceiving, is by this point, you should notice what happened at Stalingrad. We've already got a moment that's taking place where the Russians have been able to stop the advance of the Germans. So when D-Day happens, Russians have been saying, would you please open up a second front? When we finally open up a second front, it's because the Russians are already moving this direction. And so we invaded D-Day to take out the Germans and to invade France. There's also a fear, though, that if America doesn't get into there and the British don't get involved, the Russians are moving this direction, and they're now hopping mad at the Germans, but they're also not thrilled with the United States or the British, and they're now winning. They got Lend-Lease supplies, but they've bled a ton for this battle. There's the question is, where will they stop? And so what'll happen is then when we meet with the Russians in Germany, there's going to be, after World War II, something called the Cold War, where Russia and the United States will then be battling against one another. So hopefully that's good enough for the question about what was taking place when it came to the battles in between. When it comes to the Pacific battles that you need to notice, Midway is going to be the last major offensive battle that the Japanese are going to be able to put towards the United States. They attack, and America is able to wipe out multiple of their aircraft carriers. And this is the first naval battle where the ships never saw each other, but the planes from the ships did. So this is where naval power is going to become less important than air power. And that's going to change the way that our course works for the entire rest of the class. Let me see here. Did the British spill radar technology to the Allies or keep it to themselves? Each of the countries have been playing around with it somewhat on their own. So by the time we got to World War II in 1941, America has already developed their radar technology. It's not super, but it's getting better. But that's one of the classic stories about Pearl Harbor. is when the Japanese were coming in, the Pearl Harbor air group was anticipating bombers to come from the west coast of the United States. And so when the Japanese planes arrived, the radar operators weren't certain if it was an attack or if it was the bombers coming in until it was too late. Let me see here. Did the good neighbor policy gain any allies that would be crucial in World War II? We had plenty of Latin American countries that did not openly join with fascists during World War II. Although you will find that there are Latin American countries like Argentina where Nazis were able to sneak off after World War II and find places to hide for years until they were hunted down by Nazi hunters who were able to kind of find out where they were hiding. Let me see here. What kind of embargoes did we put on Japan? When Japan invaded Manchuria, we then placed embargoes on them for steel, oil, and rubber as the big things that we were focused on. Any materials that might be able to help them to build war stuff is what we put the clamps on. And that's going to be the reason why they had to make a decision quickly. And that decision was Pearl Harbor, where if they waited too long, their military would not be up to snuff to be able to continue the war plans that they had in the future. All right, so the questions that I'm now through all of the review questions that I have on my pages. Let me just do a double check to see if anybody has doubled back to here. I don't see anything. Cool. So we've got 3 questions off to the side. Feel free to post any more that you guys have. Sophia, why did companies increase wages in the 1940s? You're getting into supply and demand. And so when you look at supply and demand, what's going to be happening during World War II is you're going to have in World War II the same thing they had in World War I. They're going to put wage and price controls into place where instead of having too many workers like we had in the 1920s and 30s, you've now got too few. The factories are getting contracts from Franklin Roosevelt. And when you were watching your documentary, he went through a laundry list of how many Liberty ships and airplanes and tanks and bombs that he wanted to build. And they're pretty much assuming that the factories are going to be running 24/7 if they can find the workers. And so there are some workers who, after going for a decade with no work because of the Great Depression, there were stories of people who would like set up a cot inside the factory so that they could like get a little bit of downtime sleeping and then get out of their cot, jump right back in the assembly line and keep doing what they're doing because this is a steady paycheck. Because they don't have enough workers, though, they are going to have to increase wages to compete against other businesses. And that's essentially what they've been waiting for throughout the Great Depression is could they get enough demand generated that then you have workers who are in demand and then they could ask for better wages. Ian, I see your 2 questions. Which countries decided to vote for German occupation besides the Czech and Austria? And why was this significant? For our class, it's not going to be all that vitally significant to know every country that welcomed the Nazis in. The only thing that we wanted to keep in mind is remember what happened in Eastern Europe with Woodrow Wilson. He was talking about self-determination. And so they took out their pencils at the Treaty of Versailles and they redrew Eastern Europe to create like Czechoslovakia, a brand new Austria and Hungary, a Poland that was carved out of previous territories. But the problem is it was like our war or peace game where they took existing countries and then they carved off this chunk and said, you are now Poland, you are now Czechoslovakia. And it would be kind of like if we carved off your neighborhood and said it was now, some new city. But you didn't want to move, you didn't want to change, and you wanted to remain where you're from, like from Plymouth, as a Minnesotan, as an American. So when the Germans come in and they say, you know what, we know that you're German culturally, we know you never wanted to leave. There are many people who are like, dang right, especially because they're nationalistic in nature. And so that's why you have places like Austria welcoming back the Germans with open arms because they feel like they were separated by other countries like England, France, the United States, who had no business doing that. And afterwards, they didn't use the League of Nations or their military might to actually enforce it in the future. And Hitler announced that he had a better plan. Depression was over for him also. So bringing that to them was nice in their viewpoint. And many people throughout the world had anti-Semitic viewpoints that ranged all the way back to antiquity. And those viewpoints were then confirmed by the Germans, who were able to play on them, and they could come in and say, "Are you tired of the Great Depression? It's the Jews who did it to you," and they could use that as motivation then to stoke nationalism, alliances, and then also the Holocaust. Let me see here. Even though Congress gave 30 million to the Scandinavian countries for defense, why didn't FDR decide to aid militarily instead of just money? Was there a reason beside the Neutrality Act of 1939? Okay, I got you. One of the dilemmas that you're facing is America has the problem in World War II that Germany had in World War One. So while we have a lot of people enlisting, and while we've got a lot of weapons being built, one of the things with the Neutrality Acts is they decided in the period from the 1920s to the 1930s to not build weaponry or modernize, with the idea that that would then be enticing for us to get into a war. And so I've seen documentaries where, like, they've got World War II veterans who tell the stories that when they were training to learn how to fight against tanks, they had a truck that would drive around the field with a sign on the side that said tank. And in order to use grenades, they would take like tomato cans from the mess hall, fill them up with rocks, and that's how they'd learn how to throw grenades. And so what's happening is with the soldiers, they don't have the weaponry, they're not up to speed, and we don't join the war until 1941. So in December of 1941, we have to ramp up quickly. So that's the reason why you see like the difficulty in World War II, where it takes us months to take out the convoys, take out the submarines that are attacking convoys in the Atlantic Ocean. It takes us a while to use Lend and Lease to build up our military bases through like the Mediterranean with the North African coast. And in particular, we're making a decision that we can't send all the supplies everywhere because of the fact that our factories have been sitting empty and not used. So FDR has to plan how he's going to do the contracts, organize how the business they're going to do. He uses a version of like the NRA, the National Industrial Recovery Administration, where he tries to work out business and government partnerships to try to figure out how to make sure that they're up to speed. And then once they start massively producing weapons, when you get to 1943, 1944, they've now got enough weapons and they've got plenty of people enlisting, and that's going to be the trick to the war. Our Sherman tanks aren't as good as the German tanks are. We just can produce tons of them compared to the few that the Germans can produce. So when you get to 43, 44, you've now got us sending troops in. But when you're talking about the Scandinavian countries at the start of World War II, we're having trouble with just our major objectives, much less being able to send active duty troops into those countries and trying to get them there. In between England and Scandinavia, you've got German U-boats, battleships, airplanes from the mainland that can attack ships that make a move on that. And if you staged an invasion and went wrong, that would be super embarrassing. Let me see here. Can I explain the Smith-Connolly Anti-Strike Act? So when you take a look at Smith-Connolly, just a second. The Smith-Connolly Act is going to be created in 1943, and what's happening is Congress is going to create this law. Franklin Roosevelt wasn't a huge fan of it because of the fact that you had an anti-union strike law. But in 1943, the legislature was really nervous that if workers could go on strike, they could then impede the war effort. And there was a feeling, especially with conservatives, that these might be communists, radicals, anarchists who are anti-war. So the Smith-Connolly Anti-Strike Act is going to tell workers in the factories you're not allowed to go on strike. At the same time, though, we've got wage and price controls where the government is ensuring that workers aren't getting gouged with the cheapest wages that are out there. And so there are things in place that are trying to protect the workers. But the workers also are not thrilled with the fact that they could be demanding far more, given the fact that there's not enough workers for all the work. They're being worked like crazy. And they'd like to make cash, especially to make up for the lost time they had with the Great Depression. In the court case Korematsu versus the United States, the Korematsu case was involving an individual who was suing to argue that he should not be put into an internment camp, that internment camps were illegal, violation of your civil rights. in particular because it was taking away your freedom because of the suspicion that you might be involved in some sort of activities. The internment camps are really a dark spot in U.S. history because of the fact that we were worried about the fact that there were spies operating in Hawaii who were able to help the Japanese figure out what the lay of the land was at Pearl Harbor. The problem, though, was that those individuals were the vast minority of Japanese citizens who were living, and most of the Japanese people living in Hawaii were Nisei, who were loyal to the United States and were distantly removed from being Japanese citizens because of our ethnic and racial stereotypes that we had during the time. Though it was really hard convincing regular everyday Americans to believe that, and so Franklin Roosevelt was swayed to deliver Executive Order 9066 that created our internment camps. The name that you should notice, though, is J. Edgar Hoover. J. Edgar Hoover is not related to Herbert Hoover. He eventually is going to become the head of the FBI, and he is going to be somebody who is working to try to protect against spying that's happening here inside the United States. So he is working with our intelligence community. He went to Franklin Roosevelt and said, "There's no concern about Japanese spies coming into our country in large numbers. We got a pretty good idea who the radicals are." But FDR, in spite of that objection, is going to argue that we should take all the Japanese citizens on the west coast of the United States, take them from their homes, move them to internment camps, so there's no chance that they could be engaged in sabotage. We're going to take some people who are German and some people who are, you're okay. Some people who are German and some people who are Italian. But these are people, see ya, who are actually involved in like pro-Nazi or pro-Mussolini movements. Like we have a group called the Bund, that is the American Nazi movement. But we're not going to round up all the Germans. We're not going to round up all the Italians. We do so to the Japanese, though. Let me see here. Ian, why did the collapse of the Italian fascist regime start the crumbling of the Axis powers? It was widely understood that the Italians were the weaker of the three countries that were involved in World War II for the Axis. Italy's economy wasn't that big. They were fascist in nature, and they were providing a southern assist to the Nazis. But when it came to their military strength, it was understood that the Italians were not moving at the same speed the Nazis were. And in fact, once America was able to clear the Germans from North Africa and they started moving into Italy, Mussolini's government started crumbling. Many of the Italians themselves didn't like the fascist government, and they didn't want to be part of World War II, especially since it was pretty apparent they were on the losing side. When Mussolini was trying to flee from the country, he was then captured and dragged through the streets and killed with his wife before they could flee. And so, especially when you look at Italy, by the time the Americans and the British worked their way about midway through the boot of Italy, eventually the Italian forces crumble, and it's Nazis who are there instead from Germany who are defending in the Alps and slowing down the process. We're going to find, though, that when it comes to like the crumbling of the Italian army, the movement into North Italy is going to happen in 1944. And so we're going to find that they're still slowly working their way through the Alps when America is going to be involved in D-Day, moving it through the Battle of the Bulge. And so it's really slow going midway through Italy because moving through mountainous terrain is really rough. Let me see here. Can I explain what the Office of Price Administration did? Sure. When you think about war, war is something that can be a stimulant to the economy, but our capitalistic society is based on supply and demand. And so when you move into your economics courses, you're going to learn about what's called supply and demand curves. And what that means is as you increase or decrease the supply or demand of something, it then has a relationship on prices. So if you think about World War II, like I already described for you with the workers, you've now taken tons of unemployed workers and moved them into soldier jobs in the military. So much so that we're going to have a second great migration of African Americans north. We're going to have Rosie the Riveter, women moving into the factories. And even then, that's not enough for all the production that our factories are doing. So if you allowed market principles to work, If you have less workers and you've got more jobs that need to be done, that should then lead to wage increases because these business owners should be doing something to appeal to these guys to try to attract them to work the jobs that are needed. The problem is if you allow that cycle to take place, you're going to have strikes, you're going to have wages that start getting out of control. If you have to pay your workers too much, then you don't have much money left over to actually produce the stuff that you're trying to produce. And on the other hand, if you are trying to buy stuff, we've got all sorts of people who are needing our stuff. Gasoline is needed by our military, food and clothing is needed by our military, which means the amount of that stuff that's left for consumers at home is really low. If there's not a lot of like canned peaches and there's tons of people who would like to buy them, the price of these peaches should be able to shoot through the roof because of supply and demand. So what Franklin Roosevelt is going to do is instead of allowing inflation to run out of control, he's going to create the Office of Price Administration, which is going to set maximum prices that can be charged on products that people are buying in the day to day. Now, the problem is if the market is not allowed to control prices, if there's very few peaches, you'd normally jack up the prices then so that you'd be able to make money off of that because they're scarce. If the price stays low, you'll sell out of all your peaches and be in trouble. So that's why they've got ration books that they're using during this time. You're only allowed to buy a certain amount of fruit, vegetables, meat, gasoline, and that way they can artificially keep prices at a certain level, which is very much regulation on the level that would be seen as like socialism, communism, if you wanted to go there. But this is also seen as like intensely managed warfare where you're trying to marshal all of your resources, kind of like Woodrow Wilson did during World War I. This is why also you'll have people creating like victory gardens and those sorts of things in order to produce the stuff at home that they would need. And then also they're doing scrap drives where during World War II, the amount of scrimping that they're doing, they're going through the woods and trying to find like scrap metal to bring off to war facilities. What's even weirder, though, is you can actually create explosives from animal fats that come from cooking foods. They would take like bacon grease and collect it, and then that would be used to be turned into explosives that would be used in the war effort. And all of that stuff is seen as patriotic things you can do to help out with the war. I don't see any other questions yet on this board. I will go back to my message board to see if there's anything that pops up there. Again, 25 question test tomorrow, though. So if you are somebody who is super worried, remember this is about half the value of other sorts of tests. And so I think that you've covered a lot of the bases really nicely. So I don't know that there's a lot more ground for us to cover, but any other questions I'll totally take care of before you guys dip out. Ian, I see, is the island hopping happening at the same time as D-Day and the invasion of Italy? Was the focus on the Japanese a stronger movement force than the double front of Germany? Gotcha. So remember the ABC-1 plan in Germany first, but that doesn't mean that we're doing nothing in the Pacific. What that means is you've got Army, Navy, and Marines who are trying to take whatever resources that are left that aren't being used in the European theater, and they're trying to use them in the Pacific theater to fight against the Japanese. This is going to make Douglas MacArthur really mad. So he's the head of the Pacific operations, and he's openly telling everybody that if he could just get like a battleship, or if he could just get some more weaponry, some more airplanes, that they could do a lot of damage to the Japanese. But instead, what's going to be happening is Japan is going to expand outwards and take over a huge chunk of the Pacific Ocean. And the fighting there is going to be brutal and horrific. The Japanese will dig in, they'll fight to the death, they'll engage in suicidal attacks. And it's really demoralizing what's happening with that. And so what'll happen is for MacArthur, you should know, like, notice what happened with like the Battle of Coral Sea. We do have our Navy that can stop a Japanese invasion before it takes over Australia. Japan will take over a couple of our Aleutian Islands. Those are the islands that kind of stick off from Alaska, and turn those into military bases for a short period of time. But it's that attack at Midway where Japan keeps expanding outwards, and then at Midway, America is able to use their fighter planes and bombers to find the Japanese aircraft carriers, sink a bunch of them, and it's from that point forward that Japan is really in a tough spot, because without those aircraft carriers, they can't defend their ships with air power, and so their sphere starts shrinking. Island hopping then is happening at the same time that we've got European affairs taking place. And what MacArthur is going to come up with is the idea that replaces Alfred Mahan's philosophy about imperialism. And in fact, what's going to be interesting about the rest of our course is you're going to find that America's interest in taking over whole island groups, especially if they're filled with people whose nationalities makes us uncomfortable during this period where racism is going to pop up again, taking over islands of like Samoans or others, it's going to be something where it adds in that element of for white supremacists, they don't want to have individuals who are not white becoming citizens of the United States. And so instead of taking over whole islands, America starts realizing if you just take over an air base, you can then use your airplanes to develop a radius of defense that they can then fly over, and then you don't have to take over all the other land and the people who need defending. You can just protect that little sliver of land that you've got. So they'll be island hopping throughout the course of the war. And then as things start getting better with the arsenal of democracy in 1943, 1944, more weapons will start going to the Pacific, more soldiers, especially as the war starts going better following D-Day. The resources start coming in to allow the Americans to hop from island to island. And they're going to try to create an island structure where they've got this air radius that they can protect. And then if they need to mop up other islands that they skipped over, they can bomb them or whatever without having to send in full-blown invasions. Because when you send in the full-blown invasion, then you're gonna have a lot of bloody warfare taking place. Aaron, what big role did the code talkers play against Japan and Germany? More so Japan than Germany. So when we take a look at the situation in Germany, we're going to be taking a look at a couple stories tomorrow after the test is done, where we've got spies and that sort of stuff going on. America's code breakers and England's code breakers are really good at breaking apart the German code, especially when they're able to steal a copy of their Enigma machine that they're using to code their messages. The Japanese code was already cracked before World War II got started, so America was listening in on the conversations. They just didn't have the ability to anticipate with Pearl Harbor that the attack would be happening there. But this is one of those great stories where the diversity of the United States really comes shining through. And I wish it didn't sound like I was just being like tokenistic and pulling this out as like a happy sort of moment. But the Navajo and other Native American groups, it's striking that given what has happened in U.S. history, we have really high percentage of Native Americans who enlist in military service in spite of all of the broken treaties and other things that we've highlighted throughout the course of the class. So when you hear me talking about those instances, it's to make you aware, but for many Native Americans, because of a multitude of different reasons, because of economic opportunity or an opportunity to make a way off the reservations or whatever, Native Americans would find their way into the military, and a group, the Navajo, had a language that they could speak to one another, that didn't follow the arbitrary rules of either code or language. And so for the United States, we would just have Navajo code talkers where in the Pacific, they would just talk normally to one another all over the radio system. The Japanese would hear it. They didn't even try to like encode it or anything, but the Japanese would hear these two Native Americans speaking to one another on the radio, not be able to make any sense out of what was going on. And that was the American code in the Pacific when they were trying to plan their operations. And so it was something where for the Japanese, their view of nationalism and superiority meant that they didn't devote much of any time to studying the native groups that were here inside the United States, much less their language. And so that was an advantage the United States could use against them. Don't see any other questions. I'll hold for a second just to see if they pop up. Again, thanks for all the questions tonight. I hope that this is helpful for you. Feel free to send me an email message if you've got any other sorts of problems. In the past, this test has been one that's been pretty doable for kids. So I'm hoping that you're feeling pretty confident when you come to class tomorrow. I'm excited to see you guys for at least one day before we turn you loose for another day off for the ACT testing. So not seeing anything else, so I'm assuming that we are good for tonight. Have a great evening. I'll see you guys tomorrow.